Picture this. A quiet cul-de-sac in Kennesaw, Georgia. Birds chirping, lawns trimmed to military precision, a pond that screams community brochure. And on the north-facing wall of one 77-year-old's townhome, a smear of green algae so menacing the HOA practically heard the Jaws theme. Add a ladder napping beside the wall and a humble bucket of water minding its own business, and you've got yourself the beginning of a suburban legal thriller. That 77-year-old is George Watson, and his alleged crimes against curb appeal triggered a chain reaction that would make a Rube Goldberg machine blush. Violations, daily fines, interest, attorney letters, lien, foreclosure. Over algae. Over a bucket. Over a ladder. Welcome to HOA Wars, where the petty is powerful and the stakes are your house. Let's get clinical for a second, because behind every HOA meltdown is paperwork with teeth. According to documents, the Cedar Lake Townhome Association didn't go for a slap on the wrist. They went for a metronome of pain, $50 per day for 4 months, October through January, plus 7% interest on top of the regular $180 per month dues. If you've ever wondered how a wash your siding note becomes a 4-figure financial migraine, that's the recipe. Slow roast a homeowner on low heat with daily fines, baste with interest, garnish with legal fees, and serve with a lien. Chef's kiss. Okay, but couldn't George just pay it and move on? If only HOA math were that kind. First, George didn't even see the warnings for months. During the pandemic, he developed a genuine phobia of mail. Yes, the USPS kind. So notices piled up like snowdrifts. By the time he finally opened a letter in late 2022, the tab wasn't, "Please clean your siding." It was a lawyer's bill for $6,000 and a vibe that said, "You are already behind in a race you didn't know you were running." When people say, check your mail, they're not being nosy. They're giving you the homeowner equivalent of hydrate and stretch. Now, George isn't some algae truther refusing to wash the wall on principle. He actually borrowed a pressure washer and a ladder from a neighbor to fix the issue, just not on the timeline the HOA demanded. The man's on Social Security, living on roughly $20,000 a year, trying to hold on to the one piece of equity that represents his life's work. He's lived in Cedar Lake since 2001. This isn't a rando flipper ignoring the rules. This is a long-timer trying to keep his footing while the ground turns into legal quicksand. And while he was trying to play catch-up, the fees weren't taking a nap. They were breeding. That's how you wake up one day and hear the phrase, "We've filed for foreclosure." Here's where the HOA playbook goes from firm to ferocious. In July 2024, after placing a lien, the association filed to foreclose. Why so fast? Because Georgia law loads the HOA with tools sharper than your average toolkit. They can lien for any amount and move to foreclose once the balance clears $2,000. That threshold is less nuclear and more everyday button. When dues, fines, interest, and legal fees team up, $2,000 is a speed bump, not a mountain. You don't need a villain twirling a mustache. You just need momentum, a ledger, and a bylaw binder thick enough to be its own end table. And yes, this isn't some rumor whispered at the mailbox. Multiple outlets have covered the case, down to the $50 per day figure, the interest rate, and the foreclosure filing. The numbers aren't a vibe. They're documented. Legal costs alone had crossed $3,600 by October 2024. That's before we talk about the emotional tab. Anxiety, sleeplessness, depression, the unbillable costs that ruin your appetite and your evenings. At one point, George even took out an equity loan to keep fighting. If you've ever felt like you're bailing out a boat with a thimble, you already understand HOA litigation. Now for the chorus line you always hear in these stories. We followed procedure. The HOA president zipped their lips, punted to management and counsel, and the management company CEO delivered the classic refrain. We gave him every opportunity. Mail was sent. Our covenants allow notice by U.S. mail. Choosing not to read it isn't our problem. Legally, that tracks. Morally, it lands like a cold voicemail. If the covenant says mail it, mailing it is compliance. Whether the human on the other end is panicking about envelopes mid-pandemic doesn't change the statute. It's the eternal HOA paradox. The rules protect the community until the rules bulldoze the neighbor. And yet, there's a counter melody. A real estate attorney who represents both HOAs and homeowners called the question we're all thinking. Do you really want to take the home of a 70 or 80-year-old over this? He floated options that make a lot of sense in the real world, payment plans for fixed-income residents, or even using the HOA's self-help powers, authorized in many bylaws, to just fix the problem and bill a reasonable amount. Move the ladder, dump the bucket, pressure wash the wall. Cheaper than litigation, kinder than foreclosure, less likely to blow up on the 6 o'clock news. Neighbor stuff. If you're keeping score at home, here's the play-by-play highlight reel. Minor exterior grime to violation notices, unread, fines compound, interest accrues, attorney letters arrive like thunder, lien attaches, foreclosure proceeding filed, homeowner scrambles, borrows, begs, bargains, HOA says, policy is policy. And somewhere in this montage, community spirit quietly slips out the side door with a suitcase. The predictable endgame is a courtroom, a judge, and a stack of exhibits about algae, buckets, and ladders. That's not a metaphor. Those are actual characters in this drama. But here's the part that should make every HOA board member and homeowner lean forward. Precedent and publicity. This isn't just a local spat. It's a national cautionary tale. Media coverage has amplified it, lawmakers are paying attention, and ordinary homeowners are realizing that missing a window washing deadline can snowball into an existential threat to their home. The HOA gives HOAs a lot of leverage, but leverage used without judgment can snap the beam you're standing on. Today, it's George and algae. Tomorrow, it's you and a mailbox you painted one shade too spicy. And if you think, my HOA would never, remember, your board changes, your management changes, your luck changes. The bylaws, those stay. If algae and a bucket can yank the pin on a foreclosure grenade, what exactly are the fine print tripwires hiding in your HOA documents, and how do they quietly turn ordinary homeowners overcooked? Ready for the recipe?
Let's be real. Most of us think HOA rules are like suggestions with a side of nagging. Trim your shrubs, move your trash cans, pressure wash the siding sometime this decade. Annoying? Sure. Life-threatening? Not so much. But in George Watson's case, those suggestions were booby-trapped with financial TNT. And all it took was a smear of algae, a nap-time ladder, and an ignored mailbox to trigger the detonation. This is how HOAs manufacture debt, not with one big hammer blow, but with a factory of fines, humming along like a conveyor belt. Each day the problem isn't fixed to their satisfaction, the meter runs. And like a cab ride in New York City, the longer you sit still, the bigger the tab. In George's neighborhood, the Cedar Lake HOA, the baseline fine was $50 per day. Not a week, not a month, a day. Think of it as the HOA version of surge pricing. You forget to clean algae for 10 days? That's $500. Miss it for a month? $1,500. 4 months? That's $6,000 before you even tack on interest. And unlike parking tickets or speeding fines, these things don't top out. There's no cap. It's a slow financial IV drip straight into your HOA's veins, and you're the donor whether you like it or not. Now, sprinkle in 7% interest. Sounds small, right? It's not. At $6,000 in base fines, that's $420 a year just in interest. And it compounds. Imagine paying your credit card bill late every single month for years. That's the kind of quicksand HOAs love to throw under your feet. By October 2024, Georgia's legal fees alone were more than $3,600, and interest was still dancing on the pile like it owned the place. This isn't a fee schedule, it's a casino, and the house always wins. Here's the trick. Fines don't work in isolation. They're designed to snowball. One violation turns into dozens of charges. By the time you wake up, you're not fighting algae, you're fighting math. Day 1, $50 fine. Day 10, $500. Day 30, $1,500. Month 4, $6,000. Add interest and attorney's fees, welcome to $9,000 plus territory. For a retiree on $20,000 a year, that's nearly half his annual income. Imagine losing 6 months of your pay because you didn't rent a power washer fast enough.
That's not enforcement, that's extortion in khakis. When challenged, HOAs always sing the same song. We followed the rules. It's in the covenants. We gave notice. And legally, they're often right. The Cedar Lake HOA's management company made it clear. They mailed violation letters. The law says mailing is enough. Whether George opened them or not their problem. It's a cold defense, but it's airtight in court. Covenants don't care about phobias, pandemics, or fixed incomes. They care about compliance. And compliance is binary. ALGAE gone equals good. ALGAE still there equals money printer go burr. Now here's where the fine factory becomes truly evil genius. It's not just about money. It's about psychology. The longer you ignore the problem, the scarier the bill gets. And the scarier the bill gets, the less likely you are to open your mail, call the HOA, or try to negotiate. You get stuck in a shame spiral. Suddenly, you're not just avoiding ALGAE, you're avoiding the HOA entirely. That's when they pounce with liens and foreclosure. Think of it like gym memberships. The whole business model is based on you avoiding the gym but still paying the fee. HOAs, though, they don't want you to pay for nothing. They want you to pay more for nothing. Here's the dark little secret. For some HOAs, fines aren't just deterrents. They're revenue streams. $50 per day per homeowner? Cash flow. Add late fees and interest? Even more cash flow. Toss in attorney's fees? Jackpot. And the kicker? Some covenants allow HOAs to use collected fines for general community benefit. That means your ALGAE fine could end up funding the very pool you're banned from using until you pay it. Congratulations, you just bought everyone else's summer swim. Let's simplify this with an analogy. Imagine you hop into a taxi and the driver refuses to move until you clean a stain on your shirt. Every second you sit there, the meter runs. By the time you finally figure out how to wash the shirt, the bill is higher than the car's resale value. That's how HOA fines work. They don't want you to ride. They want you to sit. You might think, surely a judge will laugh this out of court. Spoiler, nope. Courts generally uphold HOA fines if they're in the governing documents and procedures were followed. In Georgia, once the debt hits $2,000, foreclosure is fair game. George crossed that line in a matter of weeks. So when you see an HOA foreclosure over ALGAE, don't think this is a freak case. Think this is exactly how the system is designed. The bylaws are booby-trapped and the courts are the tripwire. For George, the fine factory wasn't just math. It was misery, sleepless nights, depression, the humiliation of borrowing tools from neighbors while legal bills piled up, the dread of losing a home he'd owned since 2001. That's the real damage, not the $9,000 debt, but the human cost of being ground up by a system that never pauses. Fact number 2 is the ugly truth. Fines aren't small slaps, they're factories. They churn daily, pile on interest, and escalate into liens faster than you can say, I'll get to it this weekend. And once that machine starts humming, it doesn't stop until you either pay up, lawyer up, or lose the roof over your head. When you think of home ownership nightmares, you probably imagine burst pipes, termites, or maybe a roof that decides to leak the night before Thanksgiving. What you don't expect is the silent villain waiting in your driveway every afternoon. Your mailbox. For George Watson, the 77-year-old at the center of this HOA foreclosure saga, his mailbox wasn't just an aluminum box on a stick, it was a Pandora's box. And once he stopped opening it, the HOA's entire fine factory became an ambush waiting to happen. This wasn't laziness or forgetfulness, it was deeper, a pandemic-born phobia of mail. Yes, mail. Envelopes, bills, notices, junk coupons for pizza chains that somehow know your exact weaknesses. For George, mail went from mundane chore to source of anxiety. And in HOA land, ignoring your mail isn't just inconvenient, it's catastrophic. The COVID-19 pandemic left scars everywhere. Isolation, health fears, disrupted routines. For George, it triggered something psychologists call mail avoidance behavior. Think of it like bill PTSD. The stress of bad news building up over months made his mailbox feel radioactive, so he stopped checking. Meanwhile, the HOA didn't stop sending. Notice after notice piled up like unopened love letters from a very angry, very litigious pen pal. To the Cedar Lake HOA, the system was working. To George, ignorance was bliss, until it wasn't. By the time he finally forced himself to open his mailbox in late 2022, what did he find? Not gentle reminders, not neighborly nudges. A bill for $6,000 from the HOA's attorney. Like a horror movie jump scare, the villain wasn't in the bushes, it was in the envelope. Here's where the HOA playbook looks heartless, but airtight. Most governing documents, including Cedar Lake's, only require notice by U.S. mail. That's it. They don't have to knock on your door, they don't have to email, they don't have to confirm you opened it. As long as they drop that envelope in a blue box, they're legally covered. It's like your friend saying, "I texted you, so it's not my fault you never turned your phone on." Only here, the consequences aren't missing brunch. They're foreclosure. So when George argued he didn't see the notices, the management company shrugged. Their CEO literally said, "If someone chooses not to check their mail, there's nothing we can do about that." Cold? Yes. Legally bulletproof? Also yes. This is where the snowball became an avalanche. Because George wasn't checking his mail, he had no idea how fast fines were stacking, that interest was quietly compounding, that legal fees were adding fuel to the fire. Had he seen the first or second letter, maybe he could have borrowed that pressure washer sooner. Maybe he could have negotiated. Maybe he could have begged for mercy before the attorney sharks circled. But without that knowledge, the fine factory ran unchecked for months. In other words, the mailbox didn't just deliver bad news. Ignoring it supercharged the crisis. Let's talk about why this happens, because George isn't alone. Psychologists describe mail avoidance as a coping mechanism. Bills trigger anxiety, you avoid the trigger, the pile grows, anxiety worsens. It's a vicious cycle. For someone on a fixed income, like George's at $20,000 a year, every envelope feels like a potential bomb. Medical bill, utility shutoff notice, HOA violation, the stress becomes unbearable, so the easiest solution is not to look. The problem is, ignoring the envelope doesn't stop the debt. It just blinds you to it until it's too late. Here's the darker truth. HOAs and their attorneys know many homeowners don't read every notice. They bank on it. The system is designed to favor the sender, not the receiver. Mailing counts. Silence is treated as guilt, and when you finally wake up, you're already drowning. In George's case, the HOA had already assessed fines, added interest, involved an attorney, and positioned itself for a lien. By the time he opened his mailbox, the train had left the station, and he was sprinting behind the caboose waving his arms. Think of it like traffic cameras. You speed through an intersection, and 2 weeks later, a ticket arrives in the mail. If you ignore your mail, you miss it. You don't get to argue, "I didn't see the letter." The fine doubles, triples, and eventually there's a warrant. The system isn't built to care about your mailbox habits. Same with HOAs. The paper trail is all that matters. Opening that envelope in 2022, George didn't see a violation notice. He saw a legal bill. That's the gut punch. Because once attorneys get involved, the numbers escalate dramatically. It's not $50 a day anymore. It's $250 an hour. You're not just paying for ALGAE fines. You're paying for lawyers to send you letters about ALGAE fines. And remember, under most covenants, if the HOA wins in court, you're on the hook for their legal fees. So George wasn't just staring at $6,000. He was staring at an open tab with no ceiling. By his own account, George spiraled. Anxiety, sleepless nights, depression. He said the stress was crushing. It wasn't just about losing money. It was about losing his sense of safety. Imagine being nearly 80 years old and realizing your home, the place you've lived in since 2001, could be taken because you couldn't face your mailbox. That's not just financial ruin, it's emotional warfare. This is where ethics clash with law. Could the HOA have tried harder? Sure. A knock on the door, a phone call, even an email. But they didn't have to, and so they didn't. Because in the HOA mindset, the burden is always on the homeowner. They play by the book, even if the book looks heartless. One attorney even suggested the HOA could have used self-help powers, fixing the issue themselves and billing George a few $100. Instead, they let it fester into thousands. Why? Because procedure, not mercy, ruled the day. Fact number 3 is the silent accelerator, the mailbox meltdown. George's fear of mail didn't cause the ALGAE, but it magnified the fallout. Notices became lawsuits, fines became foreclosure, anxiety became depression, and all because the HOA only had to prove they mailed it, not that he read it. The lesson is, in HOA land, ignorance isn't bliss, it's bankruptcy. So George finally faced the music. ALGAE cleaned, ladder gone, bucket tossed. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Because in HOA world, fixing the violation doesn't erase the fines. In fact, in number 4, we'll see how George learned the hard way that compliance isn't enough when the HOA smells money.
Here's where most reasonable people would think the story ends. George Watson, the 77-year-old retiree, finally tackles the ALGAE. He borrows a ladder, borrows a pressure washer, rolls up his sleeves, and gets the siding clean. Bucket emptied, ladder moved, community aesthetics restored. Case closed, right? Nope, not in HOA land. Because HOAs don't just care about the violation, they care about the ledger. And once that ledger fills with fines, interest, and attorney fees, cleaning up the ALGAE doesn't mean you're forgiven. It just means you're still in debt. Think of it like a parking ticket. You pay to park in the wrong spot, you get slapped with a $100 fine. You move the car, great. But you still owe the $100. Moving the car doesn't erase the ticket. Same logic here, only instead of $100, it's thousands, with interest and a foreclosure notice tucked neatly into the mix. When George finally cleaned his home and tried to explain himself, he was met with cold arithmetic. The HOA wasn't interested in hearing about pandemic phobias, borrowed ladders, or delayed compliance. They wanted the money. All of it. This is the soul-crushing part. George did what the HOA originally asked, pressure wash the siding. But because he didn't do it fast enough, the fines were already snowballing out of control. To the HOA, it wasn't about the ALGAE anymore. It was about enforcement, precedent, and dollars. And once the attorney was in the loop, the HOA had zero incentive to back off. Why? Because their legal fees are recoverable. Every extra letter, every hour billed, George was footing the tab. Imagine fixing your siding only to realize the real stain was already baked into your bank account. Here's the brutal truth. HOAs operate on compliance plus punishment. It's not fix the issue and we're square. It's fix the issue and pay for the time you didn't fix the issue. It's a double whammy. You're punished until you comply. You're punished for the time it took you to comply. George eventually got rid of the ALGAE, but by then he owed thousands. The HOA didn't care that the problem was gone. The violation was just the appetizer. The fines were the main course. If you've ever dealt with an HOA board, you know the mindset. Rules are rules, no exceptions. No, but he's 77. No, but he's on Social Security. No, but he has a legitimate mail phobia. The bylaws say daily fines, and daily fines it shall be. The HOA isn't your friend, your neighbor, or your support system. It's a corporate entity armed with lawyers, bylaws, and the power of foreclosure. And once they smell blood in the water, they double down. This mindset creates absurd situations where a problem solved still leaves a homeowner drowning in debt. It's less about property maintenance and more about power dynamics. Think about overdue library books. You check out a book, forget to return it, get charged a late fee. Finally, you bring it back. Do they waive the late fees? Nope. You still owe. The difference is your library fine might be $10. George's late fees were thousands, backed by a lien that threatened to take his home. This is what happens when HOA rules treat every missed deadline like a moral failure instead of a logistical hiccup. It's ALGAE, not arson, but the punishment landed closer to arson.
Here's the part that stings. The HOA had options. They could have offered a payment plan. Many attorneys who work with HOAs recommend this. It shows compassion, maintains community trust, and still ensures the HOA gets its money. But Cedar Lake didn't budge. No payment plan, no negotiation, no compromise. Just pay in full or lose your home. It's the classic letter of the law versus spirit of the law clash. Sure, they were within their rights, but was it neighborly? Was it proportional? Absolutely not. Why wouldn't the HOA negotiate? Simple. Fear of setting precedent. If they let George slide, other homeowners might expect leniency. And if the board's power is based on strict enforcement, any crack in the armor feels like weakness. So instead of exercising compassion, they stuck to a rigid formula. Fines plus interest plus legal fees equals pay up, even if it meant pushing a 77-year-old into foreclosure. To them, one sympathetic exception risked unraveling the entire HOA power structure. George described the ordeal as anxiety, sleeplessness, depression, and you can see why. Imagine finally fixing your siding, thinking you're done, only to realize the fight hasn't even started. The violation was just the tip of the iceberg. The debt, the liens, the foreclosure, that was the iceberg. It's like chopping the head off a hydra. You think you're free, but two more heads pop up. Except these heads wear suits, bill by the hour, and send you certified letters with phrases like notice of intent to foreclose. George's story is extreme, but the lesson applies to everyone in an HOA. Fixing a violation doesn't automatically erase the financial damage. Once the fine machine starts, it keeps running until you pay. Compliance is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. And that's what makes HOAs so dangerous. They're not just enforcing rules, they're creating debts. And those debts don't disappear once you move the ladder or toss the bucket. They stick. They grow. They threaten your home. Fact 4 is the gut punch. Negotiation denied. George complied, but it didn't matter. The ALGAE was gone, but the debt remained. The HOA wasn't interested in solutions, only settlements. And once the lawyers were in the loop, the endgame was inevitable. Lien, foreclosure, and years of stress. In HOA world, compliance doesn't buy you forgiveness. It just buys you a front row seat to your own financial crucifixion.
Every HOA has an arsenal. They've got warning letters, fines, interest, suspension of pool privileges, maybe even towing your car if you dare park in the wrong spot. But all those are small potatoes compared to the one weapon that turns an HOA from a nagging neighbor into a full-blown financial executioner: foreclosure. And in George Watson's case, that hammer came down with terrifying precision. Here's the wild part. In Georgia, the bar for foreclosure is shockingly low. An HOA doesn't need you to rack up tens of thousands in unpaid dues. Nope. They just need $2,000 in delinquency. That's it. $2,000. The kind of money you might spend on a vacation or a set of tires, or, in Georgia's case, 4 months of $50 a day fines for ALGAE. Once you cross that $2,000 line, the HOA can place a lien on your property. And with that lien comes the foreclosure option. It's like a video game boss fight, only the boss doesn't wait until you're ready. They swing as soon as the meter hits $2,000. George's fines, interest, and attorney's fees skyrocketed past that threshold faster than a Tesla in ludicrous mode. By July 2024, the Cedar Lake Townhome HOA filed for foreclosure over ALGAE, over a ladder, over a bucket. When people talk about HOAs, they usually frame it in cold, transactional terms: fines, liens, foreclosure filings, legal procedures. But behind every line item is a human being. And in George Watson's case, that human being is a 77-year-old retiree living on about $20,000 a year in Social Security. This isn't some high-rolling investor who can absorb a hit, or a careless house flipper who treats fines like operating expenses. George is a man on a fixed income, fighting anxiety, depression, and the very real possibility of losing the home he's lived in since 2001. That's the part that makes this case less about ALGAE and more about cruelty.
From the moment foreclosure became a reality, George described his life as a spiral of anxiety and sleepless nights. Imagine lying in bed at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, knowing a board of your neighbors could take your house over something you've already cleaned. Imagine the constant thrum in your chest, the dread of every certified letter in the mail, the humiliation of explaining to friends why you might lose your home. That's not just stress. That's chronic anxiety. And at 77, that kind of stress isn't just unpleasant. It's dangerous. Elevated cortisol, high blood pressure, heart risk. The body doesn't shrug off anxiety like a 20-year-old pulling an all-nighter. Then there's the depression. When you realize you're outgunned by bylaws, attorneys, and a system tilted against you, hopelessness sets in. George admitted the ordeal left him depressed. That tracks. The symptoms line up perfectly. Fatigue, loss of appetite, withdrawal, difficulty concentrating. HOA disputes aren't just financial wars. They're emotional meat grinders. You're not just paying fines, you're paying in mental health. And unlike the ledger, there's no balancing that account. Here's the cruel irony. To fight foreclosure, George had to borrow against the very home he's trying to save. He pulled out an equity loan just to afford legal defense. Think about how twisted that is. Mortgaging your safety net in order to protect it from being taken. It's like pawning your parachute while you're already in freefall. And every dollar borrowed chips away at the security that Social Security barely provides. For a man living off $20,000 a year, lawyer bills of $3,600 and counting aren't just a burden, they're a noose. Don't underestimate the social toll either. Cases like this isolate people. Who wants to tell their friends and family, I might lose my house because of ALGAE? It sounds absurd, almost laughable, until you realize the consequences are dead serious. That isolation deepens the depression, which deepens the anxiety, which makes every day feel like walking barefoot on glass. Neighbors often avoid involvement, either out of fear of retaliation from the HOA or a belief that rules are rules. That leaves homeowners like George feeling abandoned in their own communities, strangers in the neighborhoods they helped build. At 77, resilience isn't the same as at 37. Your savings are finite, your income is fixed, your ability to work extra hours is gone, your health is fragile. Losing a home at that age isn't just inconvenient, it's catastrophic. Where do you go? How do you rebuild? You can't just get a new place on Social Security. Affordable housing is scarce, waiting lists are long, and moving costs alone can drain months of income. For someone George's age, foreclosure doesn't just mean displacement, it can mean homelessness. Even if George doesn't live with family, you know they're feeling the shockwaves. Adult children, siblings, or extended relatives often end up emotionally or financially dragged into HOA battles. They worry, they pitch in money they can't spare, or they feel helpless watching a loved one unravel under pressure. The ripple effect extends far beyond the homeowner. It destabilizes families. Let's talk shame. People in George's position often feel embarrassed, even when the situation isn't their fault. Society frames foreclosure as personal failure, not systemic overreach. So instead of shouting his story from the rooftops, George and people like him internalize it. That shame compounds the depression, making it harder to reach out for help. It's psychological warfare disguised as community standards. It's tempting to think, that's his problem, not mine. But here's the kicker. George's ordeal is a warning to every homeowner in an HOA. If a 77-year-old on Social Security can face foreclosure over ALGAE, what makes you think your missed dues, your slightly crooked mailbox, or your too bright paint job won't snowball the same way? The human cost isn't just George's. it's potentially yours. Anxiety, depression, financial ruin. HOAs don't discriminate once the machine starts. Picture HOA enforcement like a chronic illness. At first, it's a nuisance, a cough, a rash, something you think will clear up. But ignored or untreated, it metastasizes. Fines grow, interest compounds, attorney fees multiply. Suddenly, the rash has consumed your whole life. That's what George lived. A manageable nuisance turned into a life-threatening crisis. Fact number 6 strips away the legalese and exposes the raw truth. HOAs don't just attack your bank account, they attack your peace of mind. George's ALGAE fine became anxiety, depression, sleepless nights, and the humiliation of mortgaging his own house to save it. For him, this isn't a case about siding. It's a case about survival. And that's why this matters. Because behind every HOA foreclosure story is a human being ground down by a system that prizes rules over compassion. And once you see the human cost, the true ugliness of HOA power becomes impossible to ignore. But while George was breaking under the weight of fines and fear, the HOA had its own mantra. We followed procedure. In fact number 7, we'll peel back the board's favorite defense and show you how rules become a shield for cruelty.
If there's one phrase that could be chiseled on the tombstone of every HOA horror story, it's this: we followed the rules. Those 4 words are the board's bulletproof vest, their courtroom mantra, their excuse for everything from ALGAE fines to foreclosure auctions. And in George Watson's case, a 77-year-old man facing foreclosure over pressure washing violations, those words became the HOA's entire personality. Here's how the HOA sees it. The bylaws say notices go out by U.S. mail. They mailed the notices. Therefore, they did their job. Never mind that George was dealing with a pandemic-induced phobia of mail. Never mind that he eventually pressure washed the siding and fixed the problem. Never mind that his entire life was spiraling into anxiety and depression. The HOA had one response locked and loaded. We followed the rules. It's technically true, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Procedure becomes the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for cruelty. When reporters tried to get a statement from the HOA president, guess what? Silence. No interviews, no comments, just a wall of legalese. That's classic HOA strategy. Let the management company or attorney speak, because they can stick to the script. And the script is always the same. We sent notices, we gave opportunities, compliance didn't happen. End of story. It's like talking to a robot programmed in corporate doublespeak. You could be crying, begging, or screaming about fairness, and the HOA just repeats, we followed the rules. In George's case, it wasn't even the board members who defended the foreclosure filing. It was the CEO of Heritage Property Management, the company running the HOA's day-to-day operations. His statement? Blunt as a hammer. If someone chooses not to check their mail, there's nothing we can do about that. Translation: compassion isn't our department. We licked the stamp. The law says that's enough. So whatever happens after that isn't on us. This isn't neighborly conflict resolution. It's corporate compliance theater. The real problem here isn't that the HOA mailed notices. It's the mindset behind it, treating rules as religion. In their worldview, covenants and bylaws are sacred texts. Enforcement is gospel. Mercy is heresy. So when George explained his mail phobia, the board didn't see a struggling retiree. They saw a non-compliant member. They saw risk. They saw precedent. And in their eyes, bending the rules for George wasn't compassion. It was weakness. Imagine going to the DMV. You're in line for 2 hours, you finally reach the counter, and you realize you're missing one form. You explain. You didn't know, your printer broke, your kid spilled juice on it. The clerk doesn't care.
No form, no license. That's the HOA mindset. Procedure matters. Humanity doesn't. The difference is the DMV clerk can't take your house if you forget the form. The HOA can. There's a reason HOAs cling to "we followed the rules." It's simple, defensible, and shields them from blame. In court, it works like armor. Judges don't want to weigh moral nuance. They want to see if bylaws were followed. And 9 times out of 10, they were. It also makes board members feel righteous. We're not the villains, we're just enforcing the rules everyone agreed to when they bought in. It's a neat trick. Responsibility shifts from the board to the governing documents. But let's talk fallout. Procedure may protect the HOA in court, but it destroys trust in the community. When neighbors see an elderly man nearly lose his home over algae, they don't think, "Wow, glad the board followed procedure." They think, if they can do that to him, they can do that to me. Boards forget that HOAs aren't just legal entities. They're supposed to be communities. But when rules eclipse relationships, the community part dies. What's left is a corporation masquerading as neighborhood governance. That's why attorneys like Randy Williams, who represents both HOAs and homeowners, publicly call this behavior out. He questioned the morality of taking the home of a retiree on a fixed income, asking if that's the human thing to do. His answer was clear. It's not. And his suggestions were painfully reasonable. Offer a payment plan. Use self-help powers to clean the algae. Show a little compassion. But the HOA wasn't interested in compassion. They were interested in compliance. Here's the philosophical core of the issue. HOAs live by the letter of the law, not the spirit. The letter says, mail notices, levy fines, foreclose if necessary. The spirit would say, protect property values, but don't destroy lives over algae. And Georgia's story shows what happens when the letter completely smothers the spirit. You get a situation that's legally justified and morally bankrupt. Fact 7 exposes the HOA's favorite defense: procedure over people. By sticking to "we followed the rules," Said Lake's HOA and their management company dodged responsibility for the human fallout. It's clean, it's legal, and it's heartless. Because at the end of the day, rules don't knock on your door and take your house. People do. And hiding behind procedure doesn't make it any less cruel. But not everyone bought the HOA's "rules are rules" excuse. Even lawyers started raising eyebrows, asking if crushing a 77-year-old over algae was really justice. In Fact 8, we'll hear from the legal voices who think HOAs have lost the plot and the smarter, simpler solutions they ignored. When your HOA's actions are so extreme that even attorneys, people who thrive on fine print and billable hours, start raising eyebrows, you know the situation has crossed into absurd territory. And that's exactly what happened in George Watson's case. Because here's the thing. The law might allow HOAs to foreclose over algae and ladders, but legality isn't the same thing as justice. And lawyers, judges, and legal scholars are beginning to say out loud what homeowners have been whispering for years. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Enter Randy Williams, a real estate attorney who works on both sides of the HOA battlefield, sometimes representing associations, sometimes defending homeowners. That balance gives him credibility because he's not just an HOA hater. He understands how boards think, but he also sees the human toll of enforcement. His take on Georgia's case? Brutal honesty. Do you really want to take the home of a 70 or 80-year-old man on a fixed income? Is that the human thing to do? This wasn't legal analysis. This was moral clarity. Williams didn't mince words. Cedar Lake's HOA had options, plenty of them, and they chose the harshest path. So what were those alternatives? Let's lay them out. Payment plans. Williams pointed out the simplest solution. Let George pay in installments. Spread the $6,000 over a year or two. On $20,000 a year of Social Security, $6,000 at once is crushing. But $250 a month for 2 years, doable, humane, and the HOA still gets their money. Self-help powers. Most HOAs have what are called self-help powers baked into their bylaws. Translation, if a homeowner doesn't fix a violation, the HOA can step in, fix it themselves, and bill the homeowner for the cost. In George's case, this would have meant hiring a contractor to pressure wash a siding and remove the bucket and ladder. Total cost? Maybe a few $100. Way cheaper than foreclosure court. Community solutions. If the HOA really cared about neighborhood harmony, they could have leaned on community spirit. Ask a neighbor with a pressure washer to help. Work with George, not against him. But community rarely makes it into HOA decision-making once fines start piling up. Instead of choosing any of these reasonable paths, Cedar Lake went for the foreclosure hammer. Why? Because procedure told them they could. Here's where the psychology of HOAs comes into play. Boards fear that if they make an exception once, they'll set a precedent. If George gets a payment plan, won't every other homeowner demand one? If George's ALGAE gets washed by the HOA, won't that encourage laziness? This fear of slippery slope thinking makes boards rigid. They'd rather destroy trust and goodwill than risk appearing weak. It's the same mentality as a school principal suspending a kid for chewing gum, not because it's dangerous, but because bending the rules might invite chaos. Think of it like parenting. A good parent balances discipline with compassion. If a teenager misses curfew once because they were helping a friend, you might ground them lightly, but also praise their loyalty. An HOA, on the other hand, is the parent who grounds you for 6 months, cancels prom, and calls your college admissions office to tell them you're unreliable. It's not about teaching lessons, it's about flexing authority. And here's the kicker. What did the HOA really achieve by being so rigid? Did they protect property values? Not really. Did they inspire confidence in the community? Hardly. What they did was make national news for trying to take a retiree's house over ALGAE. That's a PR disaster. Boards love to talk about protecting the reputation of the community, but nothing tarnishes a neighborhood's image faster than a foreclosure headline. Good luck selling a home in Cedar Lake now. Prospective buyers Googling the HOA will find stories of draconian fines and elderly homeowners in tears. Ironically, the very thing the HOA claims to protect, property values, is undermined by their heavy-handedness. Williams isn't alone. Across the country, lawyers and lawmakers are raising alarms about HOA foreclosure powers. Critics argue that allowing a $2,000 debt to trigger foreclosure is wildly disproportionate. Some are calling for reforms like raising the threshold, requiring mediation before foreclosure, or banning foreclosure for minor violations altogether. Georgia isn't unique here, but it's on the harsher side, and cases like Georgia's are becoming Exhibit A in the push for change. What makes this especially damning is that lawyers, who are often accused of being heartless themselves, are the ones saying, "This is too much." They see firsthand how homeowners like George are chewed up by the system. They know the emotional costs, depression, sleeplessness, family stress. And they know the financial absurdity, spending $10,000 in legal fees to collect $6,000 in fines. From a purely business standpoint, it doesn't even make sense. But in the HOA world, it's never just about money. It's about power. Fact number 8 shines a spotlight on the voices of reason, the lawyers who are willing to say the quiet part out loud. Cedar Lake had options: payment plans, self-help, community cooperation, all cheaper, all kinder, all smarter. But the board ignored them, hiding behind procedure. And that's the damning part. Because when even lawyers, the people who profit from disputes, are telling you you've gone too far, you know the problem isn't ALGAE. The problem is authority run amok. But if compassion and common sense weren't enough to sway the board, what about the bigger truth that HOAs often treat rules like scripture, turning covenants into commandments? In fact, number 9 will explore how rules become religion and why that mindset makes tragedies like George's almost inevitable.
If there's one thing scarier than an HOA armed with fines and foreclosure powers, it's an HOA that treats its rules not as guidelines, but as gospel. And that's exactly what George Watson ran into in Cedar Lake. a board so committed to the letter of the law that they turned ALGAE into a moral failure and foreclosure into a holy crusade. Every HOA has a set of governing documents: covenants, conditions, restrictions, CC&Rs, and bylaws. To most homeowners, these are dusty PDFs you skim once, sigh about, and then promptly forget. But to some boards, these documents aren't just rules, they're scripture. And the board? They're the clergy. When George left ALGAE on his siding, it wasn't just a maintenance issue. To Cedar Lake's HOA, it was a violation of the sacred text. And violations demand penance. Not a conversation, not a compromise, but punishment. How do rules become religion? Simple. Power dynamics. HOA board members are often volunteers, regular people. But once elected, they're handed extraordinary power, the ability to fine, lien, and foreclose. For some, that power inflates like a balloon. Suddenly, they're not just neighbors, they're enforcers. And once you start seeing yourself as an enforcer, compassion looks like weakness. Exceptions look like sin. Rules become absolute. Remember the hall monitor in middle school? The kid who took handing out tardy slips way too seriously? Give that same kid foreclosure powers, a lawyer, and a budget, and you've got yourself an HOA board member drunk on authority. George's ALGAE wasn't just grime, it was insubordination, and the board was determined to prove they couldn't be challenged. Part of what feeds this religious devotion to rules is fear of the slippery slope. If George gets compassion, won't others demand it? If the HOA lets one algae patch slide, won't the whole neighborhood collapse into chaos? That's the mindset. Every exception is a threat to the entire system. So instead of treating George as a struggling retiree, they treated him as a heretic. Like any religion, the HOA has rituals. In this case, violation letters, fines, attorney notices, liens, foreclosure filings. Each step carried out with precision, like beads on a rosary. The fact that George actually cleaned his siding didn't matter. The ritual had already begun, and once the ritual begins, it must be completed. But here's the problem with turning rules into religion. You lose sight of the humans behind them. George wasn't a careless flipper, a defiant scofflaw, or a chronic dues dodger. He was a 77-year-old on Social Security with anxiety. But the board didn't see that. They saw a violator, a sinner, a case study in why rules must be enforced without exception. And so they marched forward, even when the outcome was absurd. Foreclosure over ALGAE. Why communities suffer. When HOAs treat rules as gospel, communities suffer. Neighbors stop trusting each other. Fear replaces cooperation. Instead of helping each other, people hide from each other. That's the opposite of what community is supposed to mean. George's neighbors didn't rally around him. Why? Because they knew siding with him might paint a target on their own backs. That's how rule as religion culture erodes trust. George isn't alone. Across the country, similar stories pop up. A Florida man fined thousands for a mailbox shade that was too creamy compared to the approved eggshell. A Texas family threatened with foreclosure because their grass grew too tall while they were away burying a relative. A California homeowner sued for planting roses instead of approved shrubs. Each case has the same DNA: rigid enforcement of rules, blind to human context. Rules as religion. Why does this happen? Psychologists call it the authoritarian mindset. Give ordinary people unchecked power, and some will use it ruthlessly. They stop seeing rules as tools and start seeing them as sacred. And once you believe you're defending something sacred, compassion feels like betrayal. For Cedar Lake's board, George's ALGAE wasn't a nuisance. It was a challenge to their authority, and challenges must be crushed. Here's the bitter irony. HOAs claim their mission is to protect property values and build community,
But nothing tanks property values faster than national headlines about your HOA foreclosing on a retiree. Nothing destroys community faster than turning neighbors into adversaries. By treating rules like religion, Cedar Lake didn't protect their community. They poisoned it. Fact 9 is the cult-like core of the saga, rules as religion. For Cedar Lake's HOA, the bylaws weren't guidelines, they were commandments. And George wasn't a neighbor in need, he was a violator in sin. That mindset turned ALGAE into a holy war and foreclosure into righteous punishment. The tragedy: communities aren't churches and boards aren't clergy. But until HOAs stop worshiping rules, homeowners like George will keep being sacrificed at the altar of authority. And that brings us to the final uncomfortable truth. George's story isn't an anomaly. It's a warning. In fact number 10, we'll zoom out to the bigger picture. How HOAs across the U.S. wield foreclosure power like a weapon, and what it means for every homeowner who thinks they're safe. It's tempting to look at George Watson's nightmare, ALGAE fines, mail phobia, foreclosure filings, and say, wow, what a crazy one-off story. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It's not an outlier. It's a glimpse into the future for millions of Americans living under HOA rule. George's case in Cedar Lake, Georgia, isn't about ALGAE. It's about power. Specifically, how much power HOAs hold over people's homes, lives, and peace of mind. And once you zoom out, you see this isn't just a quirky local dispute. It's a national trend,